going well for Russia at the moment. The Ukrainians have been pushing back, and they have been pushing back hard, as I'm sure many of you have already seen. But this has come at the cost of the dear old improperly elected president of Russia, Mr. Putin, has started a not draft, that's definitely a draft, to deal with his screw ups in this war with Ukraine. So initially, what happened is when Russia invaded Ukraine, they called it a special military operation. Special military operation meaning that it was not a war in Russia, and with it not being a war, there are certain rules with which they can and cannot do with their troops. It's not a draft. They can only send in the people that are like under active military service at the moment. They have basically exhausted the resources that they had at their disposal while calling it a special military operation. So they have resorted to calling in what is essentially the National Guard to send them to fight. So about 300,000 National Guardsmen. That's not the name of them. That's not the name of who they're sending. The title of those soldiers, but that's basically what they are, as National Guardsmen. They're sending them to Ukraine to help try to fill the gaps. But a result of this is that many people have started to flee. And they've started to flee because they don't want to be drafted. And then you ask yourself, well, if they're only calling in like what's basically the National Guard, why would these people flee the country? It's because the order, I'm not entirely sure what you would call it in Russia, but we'll call it an executive order, because Putin did this himself, basically. But the executive order that calls these 300,000 troops to arms is incredibly vaguely written. And the vague language has left it open for an actual total draft to go. And despite what the Russian media has tried to put out there, the Russians do seem to understand that this war is not it's not really justified, like Putin's doing it not out of any kind of like reasonable justification to go there. He's either for glory or to like reclaim Russia or reclaim the former Soviet territories, or maybe it's a fight over natural resources because the eastern part of Ukraine has a lot of natural gas. Maybe it's a legacy thing, like it's not entirely clear what the motivation is behind this. Probably a combination of the three. But it also comes up to like it was essentially now or never, because Ukraine was trying to join NATO. They were becoming more westernized. They were becoming more potent of a country to deal with as they grew, and they were growing. So, but regardless of the reason why, none of them are good reasons to start a war. Certainly, none of them are moral reasons. I mean, this is pretty cut and dry. Who is the good guy? Who is the bad guy? Regardless of what you think of, NATO involvement or U.S. involvement or whatever your biases or ideas or moral positions are on the U.S. or NATO or Western expansion, whatever you want to call it. It's clear, given the way that the United States has behaved in Eastern Europe, the way NATO has behaved in Eastern Europe, that there was no justification for this. We were never openly militaristically hostile. We were not actively trying to take over Russia. There was no plans to actively try to start a war with Russia. They're just a country that is struggling like any other country that has a fairly low population density, a lot of land that's hard to do anything with, and not a particularly robust not a particularly robust and widespread economy. They have basically purely been run on oil for a very long time. They also have some other exports, but primarily oil, natural gas is what has kept Russia going for all these years. And the spoils of that have not even reasonably made it to the people of the country. I mean, if you go to Russia now, a lot of the nice stuff that's in Russia was built by the Soviets. Because, say what you want about the Soviets. When the Soviets decided to do something, they did it. Now, where they decided to do stuff is why the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed. They weren't, maintaining their economy in a complete fashion. They were very selective with where they decided to spend their resources. But when they spent those resources, did they spend those resources? So there's actually a lot of nice stuff in Russia left over from the Soviet Union, and a lot of the nice stuff that's left, and most of the nice stuff that's left in Russia for the general public and the general population is Soviet era stuff. So the current Russian state hasn't done a whole lot, and the money that has created these Russian oligarchs that own they own soccer teams, and they own mega yachts, and they own these giant corporations and stakes in companies all over the world. The money that has created those people did not get evenly spread to the Russian population. So they have no stake in this war. They have no financial incentive to do it. It's not like if they did manage to take over Ukraine entirely, that they would get anything out of it, because they haven't gotten anything out of the resources that are in Russia since the Soviet Union collapsed. So they don't have a stake in this game. And the proof, we'll come back to this map. The proof is in the amount of men trying to leave the country right now. So it says here, at Istanbul's main airport. This is on NPR, so it's it's not quite so crappy news. But in Istanbul, it says Russian men continue to flee the country by land or air days after President Vladimir Putin's announcement to mobilize additional forces to bolster his failing war in Ukraine. At Istanbul's main airport, a constant stream of Russian men came through the arrivals terminals. Istanbul is a destination of choice because it is one of few places where Russians can travel to without visas, and a long history of Russian tourism. So there are lots of places that won't let Russians just come in without getting a tourist visa. But Turkey is one of the few places where Russians can freely travel to for vacation. It's one of the reasons that they're still allowed to travel to Istanbul or to Turkey without a visa, is because Russians spend a lot of money in the Turkish economy as tourists. So they have that relationship built already, and it's why a lot of them are going there. So Turkey, a member of NATO, has sought to cast itself as a neutral power broker between Moscow and Kyiv, because they have a relationship with the Russian economy through tourism and probably natural gas and oil reserves. Russia sells a lot of oil and natural gas to people. So Turkey has an interest in staying neutral in that, and that's fair. You would like to think that every country would come down on the side of the clear victim in this situation, being Ukraine. But not everybody is economically set up to do that, and I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely familiar with what's happening in Turkey as far as economic reasons go. I know their government has become more authoritarian as time has gone on. They don't have a particularly good track record recently of free and fair elections and everything, but you can't expect every country to get involved. So on the face of it, I'm not going to cast aspersions at Turkey for this. I would need some more information, which I don't have. So Feel free to look it up for yourself outside of the scope of this video. Anyway, Turkey has sought to cast itself as a neutral power broker between Moscow and Kyiv and refused to join Western countries in economic sanctions on Russia. Since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February, many anti-war Russians have settled here, along with refugees from Ukraine. Flights from Russia to Turkey are sold out for the next several weeks, despite skyrocketing prices. But that hasn't stopped people from finding ways to get out, not only from Russian cities like Moscow, Sochi, not sure, Makhachkala, I am not prepared for these pronunciations, and Yekaterinburg, but also through neighboring countries, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Georgia. So essentially, anybody who is afraid that they are going to be called to action by the Russian government to go fight in this war that they don't believe in and that is not justified are trying to get the hell out as quickly as possible. And flights to countries that they can get to, they seem to be, the demand seems to be there, completely independent of how much it costs, which just goes to show you how badly people want out, that they'll pay whatever the hell the plane ticket costs to get out, because they're afraid that this is their life on the line. Because, getting back to the map, here you can see, oh man, this map doesn't work right. Okay, so you can see here all this blue along the top here. This is territory that Russia had taken over after the initial invasion, and they've held for a little while. Well, recently the Ukrainians staged a counteroffensive to try to take some land back, and you can see all of that blue there. All that blue they have there is land that they have managed to reclaim, and they have managed to reclaim it in like the last 3 weeks. So they are just blitzing through the Russian forces, and to be fair, many of them are just leaving. Actually, we can look this video up. So let's go here. Come on, we can find it. Fleeing Russian tank. Not that one. Russian tank. Russian tank hits tree. There we go. Okay, so
Russian tank abandoning their troops as they flee the Ukrainian strikes. In the presented video frames, drone footage show a Russian tank trying to flee the Ukrainian counteroffensive holding some Russian troops on top. After we see it spot a Ukrainian soldier, which judging by the video it's aiming at the Russian tank. Then after we can see many
Okay, so point is the clip right there of that tank hitting the tree. Going back to our map. That is the general level of morale that I've seen come out of the Russian military at this point. Many of the soldiers that are over there are they're not even trying to fight. They're demoralized, they're beaten, they don't care about this war, they're afraid for their lives because they're in a country that is mostly actively hostile to them. Which is different than a lot of wars that happen, where the civilian population is mostly a bystander. In a lot of wars, this happened a lot in World War II, where like armies would clash, but the people that were either in the war zone while it was happening, or they were displaced by the fighting, they were just passive participants. They weren't actively involved in the fighting. They just happened to be there. Now there were resistance fighters in many of the wars throughout the years, especially in World War II, World War I. The French did a really good job at standing up and resisting the Germans without a sort of state-run organized army. They kind of did it on their own organically. And but Ukraine seems to be a different beast for the Russians, where like almost the entire population of Ukraine, regardless of age, regardless of occupation, regardless of temperament, has just decided, nah, bro, you are not coming in here. and they are just all fighting. I mean, the stories that have come out of this war from the Ukrainian people are just harrowing, just harrowing. The school that spent an entire day making Molotov cocktails, the distillery that makes fairly strong alcohol. Normally, they just decided to make Molotov cocktails. There was a Ukrainian soldier that demolished a bridge so the Russians couldn't get over it. He was on the bridge when he blew the charge. He sacrificed himself straight up movie style to stop the Russians from having access to a bridge that would go across some river. There's a lot of rivers in here. And they weren't able to take Kyiv, even though you can see Kyiv right here on the map. Look at how close they were. That blue territory there. That was at one point controlled by Russia. And the Ukrainians have pushed them all the way back to the Russian border over here. And they seem to be making some ground in the south now. You see some blue areas around here. So all reports that I have seen have said that as this war goes on, Russia has burned through many of what the United States would call the Marines. They're like higher end, higher trained, more efficient troops. The Ukrainians have done a lot of damage to those forces. So Russia is continually relying on lesser and lesser trained troops as time goes on. Hence the reason they're calling in what's basically the National Guard and leaving an open end to potentially doing a full-on draft. Is they've also raised the age for signing up to get into the Russian military. Normally there's an age limit, but they've raised the age limit. You can now join the army if you want at a higher age. So they're trying to fill the gaps in their troops, but they've been reaching resistance at home, and it has just not been going well for them. So you can see here are some protests.
For the Kremlin, anger spilling over towards Russia's new military draft, with Putin's war in Ukraine failing. Protesters facing down the police in the Russian Republic of Dagestan. Police officers firing warning shots in the air, attempting to disperse an angry crowd. Women outraged their men are being drafted, questioning the police what the war is for.
So protests are popping up all over Russia in protest of this war. And that's no small feat in Russia, because recently they made it illegal to question the military or the actions of the Russian military in Russia. This includes through protests. You are not allowed to protest whatever the Russian military does. It is a crime punishable by imprisonment in Russia now. So the fact that people are coming out and protesting en masse is not a small thing. And the fact that men are fleeing shows that the morale in Russia is not on Russia's side. And the Ukrainians seem to be winning this war at the moment. Although they're winning this war at the moment on the backs of Western help. I mean, the Ukrainians are definitely holding up their end of the fight by actually doing the fighting, but they're having the success that they're having because the West is giving them weapons and giving them aid. And essentially, this is one of the only instances in recent memory where the United States not spending money on healthcare and spending money on bombs has resulted in a potential saving of lives. This war has been horrible. Thousands of people are dead, but it could have been so much worse if the Russian military had just been able to steamroll through Ukraine. So keep an eye out. Keep an eye on what's going on in Russia, because these protests are They are no small feat, and the Russian government is having a very hard time selling this war. They're having a very hard time selling it on the world stage. They're having a very hard time selling it domestically, and they're having a very hard time achieving their actual goals. But having said all this, and having um, a strong conviction that Ukraine is in the right in this situation. Now, I will not blanketly support Ukraine. If they start doing some really dumb stuff, they'll get their turn to have my criticism. But at the moment, they seem to be just fighting to keep their country the way that it was. They already had to give up the entire Crimean Peninsula back in 2014. So it seems like they've just had it. They've had it with Russia. But bad news coming out of this situation is the United States and Putin are currently flirting with the nuclear war rhetoric, and it's getting worse. Biden has threatened massive retaliation if Russia gets out of hand with this situation, especially if nukes are dropped. So I think, if I remember right, nukes are like the line that brings the U.S. involved in the situation, like officially, directly, not indirectly through weapons and aid. But the United States will get involved if nukes happen. And Putin has not been shy about throwing around the nuke word. Now, I happen to believe that both countries, Russia and the United States, are aware of the consequences of using nukes. And when you're trying to preserve your legacy, if that's what Putin's goal is, nukes are a really bad way to preserve your legacy because, they set off other nukes. That's the policy of a lot of countries on Earth, is if you use nukes in an attack, you will then be nuked back. Now, to be fair, Ukraine is not a nuclear-armed country. They are not part of NATO, so it's not entirely clear where the lines are. There are no running statutes for that. Putin dropped a nuke on Dallas, Texas. Yeah, all hell, it's over. But if he dropped one on Ukraine, I really don't know what would happen. I really don't. I'm not even sure what would be the right response from the United States. I don't think a militaristic response is probably the right way to go, because if Putin's willing to drop a nuke on Russia, he's probably willing to do some stupid shit on the world stage and not just next door neighbors. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Our best hope in that worst case scenario that nukes get used is that that act is so horrific and so against international standards that it pushes the countries that are currently supporting Russia, like China, North Korea, which, North Korea is probably a lost cause, but China is certainly movable on this front. Turkey, other countries like that, Belarus is in the pocket of Putin, but, crazy things can happen. But all of these countries that are involved with the situation, but not actively anti Russia in this sentiment, might come around to the other side, and then Russia is screwed because their entire economy is based around selling oil and natural gas, and if their main buyers, which happens to be China and a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, if those buyers go away, then Russia is running on very limited time to keep up this war. And then at that point, to what end? Like, even if you win, even if you get all of Ukraine, the world would already be just appalled by your actions. And they're not just because you win, just because you sign a treaty with Ukraine and be like, yeah, now Ukraine is part of Russia. The rest of the world is not just going to immediately be like, okay, wash our hands of the situation, move on with our lives, make sure you don't make any more city-sized craters. like, who knows? But, keep an eye on it, because this is as close to nuclear war as we have come since the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's the potentially first truly credible threat of a nuclear bomb being dropped in war since World War II. And it would just be awful if the world made it back to that situation. I like to think we'd move past this, but it is harder to make a peaceful world with the poor distribution of wealth and distribution of resources, and the fragmentation of government and the way that countries have separated themselves. It is harder to make that complicated system peaceful all the way around than it is to make nukes. It's easier to make nukes than it is to make world peace. So here we are in that situation. Pray for us.